Good morning everyone and welcome to our webinar. I'm Pam Tuckett, Head of Education here at Bishop Fleming, and I'm going to be your chair for this morning's webinar that we are running jointly together with VWV solicitors. For the next hour, we're going to start by covering some of the core principles that you need to be aware of, but we'd then like to open up the floor to questions that you might have. So this is your opportunity to get answers to those questions on risk management that you might have in these difficult times. We've already had some questions delivered in advance, so we'll be answering those too. I'd like to encourage you to also look at our website at the end of the webinar, just to look at our Education Knowledge Hub. There's a wealth of practical guidance on there, so I'd encourage you to do that. We've also just launched a new Knowledge Hub, which includes useful content on the transition out of COVID-19, so you might find that useful as well. I just want to run through how you can post some questions. So just to be clear on how you can do that. So you should have a Q&A icon that you can click to post a question. If you're viewing on a smartphone or a tablet, you might find that actually this takes you to a different screen, but you should still be able to see the published questions together with any questions that you've asked yourself. If you're logged onto Teams already, it should have recognised you, but if you're a guest, then you can register your name, or please do feel free, if you'd like to post a question anonymously, then that is fine as well. All of the questions will be hidden from view until we publish them, and we'll be moderating the questions as we go through. And to actually post a question, just simply click on the arrow by the question. If we don't get to all of the questions, then please rest assured we will answer them all. We will be circulating all of the questions and answers after the webinar has finished. So if we don't get to all the questions, then we will be tackling those for you. I'm just going to start with a summary of where I think we are in the academy sector. So running an academy has never been as challenging as it is right now, but as trustees and senior leadership, you must not let these challenges distract you from your core duty of a trustee, which is to protect the assets of your charity. Protecting the assets, of course, includes protecting its reserves. And in order to do this, it's essential that the trustees understand all the risks that the academy is currently facing. I would challenge any trustee to confirm that they fully understand all of the new risks that their academy is currently facing. This is where the senior leadership team will be providing invaluable support to the trust board. It will be that senior leadership team who are working tirelessly on a day-to-day basis to ensure that every possible risk is being addressed, no matter how small, to ensure that all the risks are mitigated to an acceptable level. Because the detailed knowledge is held at senior leadership team, effective communication with the trust board is absolutely essential in these difficult times. But you know, the most difficult part of this is that there's no history or previous experience that actually we can draw on to guide us through this new maze of risks that we're facing. But the academy sector has always been very good at sharing experiences and ideas. And I believe this is one of the reasons why the sector was able to respond so quickly to the challenge of opening up as Educare. The new risks are multifaceted as well. Many of the operational risks also bring a financial risk as well. The new financial regulations, such as the Procurement Policy Note 0220 and the new furlough rules, are extremely complex. And I believe there is a high risk that there are some trusts that will have interpreted the rules incorrectly and perhaps haven't taken the right level of legal advice that they should have done. Here at Bishop Fleming, we are fortunate in that we have a team of people constantly reviewing all of the new regulations as they're published in order that we are kept up to date. But that's our day job. For a trustee, that is just simply not possible. So how do you know that your academy is fully complying with all the new financial regulations? Given this complex new world, I would expect this to be a new risk on your risk register. I will leave you with that thought, and I'm now going to introduce you to our speakers. So today we're joined by Alistair Campbell, who is Head of Risk Assurance and Internal Audit at Bishop Fleming. We've also got Yvonne Spencer, who's a partner at VWV, specialising in education law, regulatory and compliance. We've also got two other experts waiting to answer any questions you may have. So I'd also like to welcome Sally Timmins, who's our National Leader of Governance at Bishop Fleming, and also Chloe Brunton, who is Partner and Head of Academies and Maintained Schools Practice at VWV, specialising in governance. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Alistair as our first speaker.
Thank you, Pam. So welcome all. I'm just going to talk about risk management in general, the general principles, but also coming on to COVID towards the end. But no doubt there'll be many questions raised, hopefully. So I'd just like to start off by saying that schools are great at managing risk. You do it every day without really thinking about it in formal terms of risk and assurance. You think about the health, the safety, the well-being, welfare and the needs of your pupils at the forefront of everything that you do. So for me, this is the key point to keep in mind. Risk management, including the expanding financial handbook and ESFA requirements, are not asking you to change any of that. In fact, quite the opposite. They're asking you to continue to mitigate the risks just as you always have done. The only difference is that you're being asked to capture and record, potentially more formally than you have before, all these good things that you're doing anyway. So by capturing and recording these things, you should gain comfort. Your trust team should be comforted, and your finance and your audit committee and full board should be comforted. It's about doing the right things, making sure that you're concentrating on doing those things and getting the value out of what you're currently doing, rather than adding a whole nother industry on top. So the ESFA agenda this year and the financial handbook published last summer had a widening view on risk and risk management, particularly expanding to cover explicitly non-financial risk as well as financial risk. And the role of the audit committee in monitoring the process and receiving those assurances was also expanded. But the overall theme for you to be aware of is to manage all risks. So making sure that those non-financial risks are equally predicated. You've got assurance over everything. And being clear that what you're doing about both those financial and non-financial risks is effective in practice. And it's the in practice bit that actually for me is the most important bit. How do you lift it off the paper? Trusts must now have a formal risk register for the first time. That was a should last year. You now must have a formal risk register. And all of the above, I believe, are beneficial developments, but if they're approached in a pragmatic and reasonable way, keep it simple. Many trusts are struggling with how to apply those regulations in practice, though. And as I said, for me, it's all about making sure that you don't, risk management doesn't become an industry itself. Keep it simple. It's not intended to be an additional burden that seemingly adds no value. If that's how it currently seems to you, then change it. Take control of it. Make it work for you. Make sure that you're not doing anything over and above what you feel that you should be that adds value to your processes. Don't be afraid that you'll receive criticism because your risk register wasn't in format X or format Y. To me, and actually the ESFA as well, it's much more important that whatever you do helps you rather than necessarily follows a certain format. Whatever you do must help you identify and list out your potential problems so you can jointly then discuss and help find solutions. Whether you're a local head, a school business manager, a CEO or a trustee, you need to be assured that you're okay in certain areas and equally be clear where you're not, where you need a bit more help, you need a bit more assurance, ultimately to help you all sleep at night. So it's the outcome for me that's important, not necessarily the journey or the format of the risk register that you've taken to get there. As long as it directs you to ask the right questions, prompts the right debate and challenge, and subsequent comfort and assurance flows at management and at committee and board level, then it means it's working for you. Don't change it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But how do you check, or how do you start if you're wondering what all this actually means? I would simply say start with the things that are worrying you and then what you're able to do about them. Are what we're able to do enough? Is it actually mitigating the risk? Is there anything more that we would need to be able to do to make sure that we've put a lid on that risk? Can we do that? So the two key questions that I always come back to for risk management, whether you're a trustee, actually if you're a trustee, these are technically your legal questions that you need to be able to answer, but it's important for trust management as well. Two key questions. Do I know the risks faced by my organisation? Number one. And importantly, number two, how am I assured that these risks are properly addressed and mitigated in practice? How do I know? Where does the comfort come from? So that second question, the assurance focused question, is just being able to answer how you know that everything is okay in practice. Does everyone know what they should be doing? Are they actually doing it? Do you know? Is it enough? Would you know? What else needs to be done? Assurance is gained from a combination of both your own internal and external assurances. Internally, most, if not all, of your assurances probably exist. You know probably that your financial controls are working quite well without us having to tell you. So therefore, the question is, what else can we help from an internal audit point of view to focus? So the question then comes, how best to focus your internal scrutiny and your auditors? Trusts are asked to review their processes for identifying and managing risks and then look at what it's telling you. Where are you okay and where do you have problems? Therefore, and it is then a therefore, you then direct your programme of internal scrutiny to help you answer or fill those gaps. So this is how best to use your internal scrutiny function or your internal auditors. Help them answer your unknowns. You probably know, as I said, that your financial controls are working well. So instead, ask your internal auditors to look at something else for you. We can still do a small check on your financial controls just to make sure that the committee is getting assurance that everything is still okay. But we can instead look at areas like human resources, performance management, recruitment, safeguarding, which Yvonne will touch on later. IT general controls, estates, health and safety. In fact, everything else on your risk register. You need to be assured that everything on that risk register, financial and non-financial, is okay. Let us help you. So the financial handbook's definition of internal scrutiny is that it should be a process that provides an independent assurance to the board that financial and other controls and your risk management procedures are operating effectively. The handbook also says the programme of internal scrutiny should be informed by the trust's risk register, which should be owned by executive management and overseen by the audit committee. The audit, or indeed a combined finance audit committee role, is to monitor the process to make sure that it's happening and that it's effective, so that you can therefore rely on the output. If the process is working, then the output is valid and you can make decisions based on it. It's also important to note that there's a key trustee responsibility to make sure that any identified actions during the good debates that take place as a result of all this wonderful risk management actually take place. A risk is only properly mitigated by the action following the discussion. Discussion is usually not enough. So the ESFA's recent announcement on internal scrutiny, asking you to decide how practical remote visits are, has led to a bit of confusion, with many trusts taking this as a bit of a suggestion that you don't need your internal scrutiny. In fact, quite the opposite. Given the points above, and also the need for to be able to put something in your end of year scrutiny report, I think that where all possible, you need to carry on with your internal scrutiny, partly to complete the end of year report, but also simply as above, because you need assurance. That's how you need to go about the world, certainly in the current situation. So the end of year scrutiny report summarises what you've done during the year, but it talks about your approach to risk management and then the outputs from that discussion. That's quite difficult to do if you've had little or no internal scrutiny taken place. You're wholly reliant, therefore, on your internal assurances. So these requirements haven't changed or been set aside due to COVID. They've actually become ever more critical. Certainly, it's a period of increased risk and change. Most existing risks have changed, and several new ones have been raised. So really, the goal is still the same, though. You need to identify and prevent or control the risk. In some cases, though, because many of you are now home working and schools are not necessarily closed but open for educare, the route or the controls that you take to mitigate that risk may be different. So therefore, particularly for COVID, the SMT need to be very aware of the risks faced, but also able to explain or articulate to the trust board how they have adopted or changed processes to make sure those risks are still addressed. Trustees in turn may be tempted not to ask questions for fear of overburdening an already stretched management team, but you absolutely do need to challenge, supportively, but you do need to challenge to be able to continue to answer both of those two key questions. Do I know the risks faced by my organisation? How am I assured that everything is okay? Trustees also need to be involved in the discussions regarding any changes to risks, what's proposed, why, what are alternatives, and that's particularly pertinent re the discussions for reopening. You need a formal risk assessment, and I know from many discussions with Trust recently that you're being asked to complete all matter of risk assessments from different quarters. It needs to be an evidenced risk assessment, so it needs to be viable. You need to be clear that it's possible. You need to take legal advice to make sure that you're clear that anything that you can and can't be done is compliant. And then the SMT need to be clear with trustees what can and can't be achieved in practice. Remember, you're only being asked to plan for reopening from the 1st or 4th of June. It's not necessarily a set date, and ultimately it is trustees' responsibility to decide whether a school can safely be reopened or not. So to do that, trustees via an audit committee ideally need to be sight of and have a full ability to challenge and scrutinise that risk assessment. Use your internal auditors. We've been talking to trusts a lot recently about the factors to consider whilst on a lockdown. Remote working, application of the PPN, as Pam said, and about risk management in general. But also, as an example, internal audit plans have changed in response to COVID. For example, a plan that included risk management, academic quality assurance and health and safety estates as a plan pre-COVID has been revised by that Trust Audit Committee. We're still looking at risk management. We've deferred academic quality to next year because it's not deemed to be a priority now. Health and safety and estates we're still looking at, but clearly with a slightly different focus on reopening. So we're still doing some of those audits, but it's about focusing the assurances where you need it. So in summary, you're all very good at managing risks pertinent to your schools, and you're doing this day in, day out. You now need to capture and make use of or rely on all that good action. You need to maintain strong governance and oversight and scrutiny. You need to ensure, or more correctly, be assured that the above controls that you are continuing to operate and they're effective. But overall, you need to have clear visibility on what's working well, on what's not working as well, and then where those resulting gaps are in the middle. Then it's over to your internal auditors or your internal scrutiny function to help you plug those gaps. So at that point, I'll hand over to Yvonne Spencer from VWV, who's going to talk to you about some of the aspects of assurance regarding safeguarding.
Thank you very much, Alistair. So what I'm going to cover today is I'm going to look at safeguarding and risk assurance during this COVID-19 period and where we are in terms of what's been happening since schools were required to close and reopen for Educare. I'm then going to look at how those requirements can be demonstrated by the trustees. And then I'm going on to talk about safeguarding and risk assessment as schools plan for reopening. So in a similar vein to what Alistair has been saying, I'd like to start by emphasising that in relation to safeguarding and risk assessment, the starting point is that the lockdown, school closure and partial reopening hasn't changed the legal duty that falls on the trustees to safeguard and promote the welfare of children, and also the duty of care that you have towards your employees. And in fact, throughout this period, the government has been producing very specific guidance on what is required to be implemented to give effect to these duties. And I want to start by looking in a little bit of detail at the requirement that the guidance that was published on the 27th of March required. This is called the Coronavirus COVID Safeguarding in Schools, Colleges and Other Providers, which was first published on the 27th of March, what it requires you to do. And what it requires is that you have the equivalent of an annex to your safeguarding policies, which cover various things, which I'll go through in a moment, so that those policies are fit for purpose while we're in this period of closure, partial closure, and then reopening. So the first thing that the guidance prescribed is the areas that the annex should cover. And so it talks about the advice that's required from local safeguarding partners. And so that's the triumvirate of statutory agencies, health, police, and children's social care, and what they are advising schools to do in relation to safeguarding issues at a local level. So that's the first thing the annex has to cover. The second thing is that the annex also covers the requirement to think about safeguarding of children who are particularly vulnerable, so those with EHC plans, children in need, and also an update on any reporting thresholds for safeguarding purposes that may have changed at this time. It also requires the annex to contain details of what staff should do if they have concerns. Now, those concerns may arise differently while remote education is being delivered or educare is being delivered for a smaller number of children. And it's really important that this annex covers in practical detail what they need to be doing in order to report concerns. And linked to that, the annex requires the schools and the trust boards to ensure that during the lockdown periods, that the availability of the designated safeguarding lead and their deputies is clearly understood. Now, it might be that these important individuals are not on site, in which case the guidance has required details to be made available as to how they can be contacted by telephone or by remote access means, and also allied to that, if they're not able to be on site, then for there to be a senior leader on site coordinating the response. And I know already we've seen examples where in the course of delivering remote education, some staff have picked up safeguarding concerns which have had to be dealt with through this revised way of working. And similarly, the annex will cover things, amendments to sharing information with statutory agencies, if there are any concerns about children the vulnerable children or children of critical workers, if they're not attending, then following those things up. Allegations of peer-on-peer abuse, that will require refinement in the annex also, because the remote working, the distancing may create a different sort of concentrated challenge for those children. Online safety, clearly very important when children are so reliant on receiving their education remotely. And so, as trustees, the advice is ensure, therefore, that your policy contains either this annex or a similar approach to show that you've that these things have been addressed, and also then to consider, allied to these changes, the other policies that need to be changed at this time. So the sorts of things that are required to be changed would be the online safety policy. Is it fit for purpose? The staff code of conduct, has that been revised so that it's fit for purpose for delivering remote education in these circumstances? Pupil welfare risk assessments, are those taking place in a different way, as you're not coming face to face with those children, and also how you're dealing with safer recruitment at this time. So thinking about, again, in the theme that Alistair has just raised, how do you ensure that these things are not only tick the boxes on paper, but are also actually being implemented? The answer is that it's really about thinking very carefully about the questions that you as trustees need to be asking. So you would already be asking yourselves as part of your risk assessments, when did you last review your safeguarding policies and procedures as a full body of trustees? So although you have a requirement for a lead trustee with safeguarding responsibility, that's actually a shared responsibility. And so you now have to think about, when did we last review these policies in light of the changes that have been required through the COVID-19 guidance. You also need to think, as time is going on, are these amendments, are they actually fit for purpose? Do they need reviewing? What is working, what isn't working? Is the advice from the local authority changing? You would also consider with that thinking about how effective referrals have been that have been made so far, and whether there have been any particular challenges. So the sorts of things that we've seen is that some local authorities have been slower to pick up those referrals, and practically what does that mean in terms of fulfilling the safeguarding obligations. So it's really about asking questions and being aware of the frameworks that exist that require these. Now, of course, it's not operational, but it is overseeing the effective implementation. Now, I'm going to just turn next to thinking about safeguarding and risk assurance as schools are planning to reopen from the 1st of June. And when we think about this reopening, effectively, academies and schools are being asked to, or called on to, provide 3 categories of education. So there is a request to deliver face-to-face education on site for reception year 1, year 6, and to provide some face-to-face support for learning, to support remote learning for years 10 and 12. There is also the ongoing, the continuing education / care of those vulnerable children and children of critical workers. And when thinking about those vulnerable children, extending the reach of the vulnerable children group. And then, of course, there's the remote education for those who are not yet able to come to school or are shielding. Now, again, the government has produced detailed guidance on how to plan for the reopening, which will shape and form your risk assessment. Now, as we sit here this morning, the only guidance that has been produced so far is in relation to primary school reopening. We are waiting imminently for the guidance in relation to secondary schools. And we expect that that will build largely on what has the primary school requirements are. So just working through that, I'm just going to give you a flavour of what is in there. So obviously carrying out risk assessments before opening to more pupils. And these risk assessments need to directly address risks associated with coronavirus to minimise risk to pupils and staff. And then making sure that pupils don't attend if they or a member of their household has symptoms of coronavirus. And we all know that this week the NHS extended the number of symptoms to 3, so it now includes loss of smell or taste. Thorough deep cleaning of the premises, minimising contact through smaller classes or groups, changing layouts of classrooms. There is included in the guidance information about creating bubbles and assigning teachers to those bubbles and not rotating their staff wherever possible in order to minimise contact and assist with tracing. So I would encourage you to work through that, and there are also a number of other materials that are available from HSE. We've seen a really good tool on the HSE Northern Ireland, which is available through our free on-stream portal for resources. And of course, there's information coming out through the associations and other groups also. Now, you know that there is a requirement to consult with the staff or to engage with the staff in relation to this. And also you need to be thinking about communication with parents and pupils at this time to understand the risk profile that they present when planning the risk assessments. And we've prepared a draft communication for parents, which is available through our on-stream portal if anyone would find that helpful. Now, in terms of looking at the policies and procedures that trustees will need to ensure are in place, a couple of things while we're staying on this theme of safeguarding. The safeguarding and remote education during coronavirus guidance has been updated, and so you would want to have an overview to make sure that what your schools and academies are doing is up to date. And also the coronavirus safeguarding in schools and colleges is being updated. And this new guidance, or the updated guidance, reinforces advice in relation to staying safe when providing remote education, teaching safely online, and helping parents to understand the importance of keeping children online. And it also reiterates the importance of having clear reporting routes for children, teachers, parents and carers to raise concerns. Now, with all of this talk, of course, about annexes, policies being reviewed and ensuring that they're fit for purpose during this period, don't forget, as part of the duty, you do need to check the effectiveness of training and updating staff, as well as pupils and parents on these policies and procedures. So, you know, that's a really key question that you need to satisfy yourselves about in terms of managing safeguarding and the risks, the attendant risks that go with that. Other things to be aware of are supporting pupils' mental health and well-being. And again, there is guidance for parents and carers on supporting children and young people during the pandemic. So be aware of that advice also. There is going to be, we're all hearing this both in the news and constant feeding on the radio as well as the sector press, around supporting pupils' mental health and well-being, and in parallel to that, of course, the mental health and well-being of the staff who have been going through this really intensive period. And for Academy Trusts, there is a requirement under the Independent School Standards Regulations to have pupil welfare risk assessments in place. And so, as well as planning for the reopening, you will also need to be planning the risk assessments that are relevant to pupil welfare. Now, those are done on an individual basis, but it's about ensuring that you have assurance from your DSL and the senior leadership team that steps have been taken to identify these relevant children and young people and to carry out those assessments. And then overall, I appreciate there's a lot. I mean, I'm touching on just one area, and I do appreciate there is a lot to consider here. But you know, I would say to trustees, that there's lots of good information out there. We've heard from Alistair and Pamela on the information that Bishop Fleming are producing, and as I've said, we've got our free portal, on-stream portal, and we are providing weekly updates through our e-zines, and there's lots of other information out there. So thank you very much, and I will hand back over.
Thanks, Yvonne. Hopefully you've all found that really useful. There are some common themes coming out in the questions actually, but I think I'll pick up one that's been, there's quite a few questions on the same sort of topic. I'll take the first one that covers it, which is, what is the role of the board versus the executive in the process to consider reopening? And I think this is probably one for you, Chloe.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. Yeah, I can see there's three separate questions to pick up, isn't there? So I think it is important to remember that the decision to reopen the school and on what basis is an operational one. So it is one primarily for the executive, but responsibility for that decision, as with any operational decision within a trust, does remain with the board, albeit that the delegated power is with the CEO or the head. So I think, given the importance of the matter at hand and the trustees' duties in respect of risk management, their duty of care, it is important for the board and executive to find an arrangement to work together to ensure that there is proper oversight of that delegated power. Now, the form of that oversight will be determined by the trust's existing procedures for risk management and any specific arrangements that they put in place for the management of COVID in particular. And any such specific arrangements should be clearly minuted and documented in writing. In terms of what those specific arrangements would be, how the board gets involved in it, we've heard we would expect the board or a committee of the board with delegated powers to review the risk assessment with the executive and to test its robustness. Other arrangements that boards are considering, some trusts we know are establishing an ongoing COVID specific committee to provide support and challenge on the matter. Chairs and vice chairs can provide support as sounding boards. Remember that chairs don't have emergency decision-making powers in the academy sector as distinct from the maintained sector. Boards should make it clear how they want to be reported to during the stage, what the sort of lines of communication would be. And the board could also think about reserved matters, so thinking about matters that must be referred back to the board or a committee for a decision. So it's not necessarily, doesn't require approval of the board as such, but the board should be consulted with, and it should have the opportunity to scrutinise the risk in order to meet those duties. Legally speaking, the board does have the ability to overrule the executive, but that would of course be very unusual circumstances and not what we would expect to see. It is possible we're going to have some further DFE guidance on the role of the board, so another guidance I'm afraid to keep an eye out for. Okay.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Chloe. Just keeping on the same theme, Sally, I think there's probably the next question for you, which is develops on the theme that Chloe was just talking about, which is, in a MAT, does a local governing body have a role to play in risk management for reopening schools, or is that the responsibility of management and the trust board?
Thanks, Pam. Absolutely, they do have a role to play. Local governing bodies have a very important role to play. Obviously with the local knowledge, the additional layer of scrutiny, and to inform the board, very much obviously in line with the trust risk management policy and process, but everybody has a responsibility to escalate any risks identified to the audit committee. But it's important to acknowledge that the local governing bodies are not deciding and not in a position to decide whether the school is reopening or not, but provide that information to the board, who will, as Chloe's just said, work in conjunction and collaboratively with the executive leaders to make the decision on whether the school reopens safely. Ultimately, it's the trustees' role, so escalate from the local governing body level, absolutely, yes.
Great, thanks, Sally. Some common questions here on internal assurance, which I guess you're going to take, Alistair. So there's a couple together here, one from James Couchman. Is internal assurance limited to the remit of the Academy's financial handbook? If not, what else should the audit committee consider as part of its regular review and risk management? But I think actually there's another question follows that immediately, which is similar. And what should the scope of an internal assurance be beyond finance, health and safety and data? What should an internal assurance programme include? Thanks.
So yeah, from my point of view, the answer to that question is whatever you need it to be. It's a slightly short answer, but actually let me expand. So your two key questions: do I know the risks faced by my organisation, and how am I assured that those risks are adequately mitigated? Really drives your internal audit plan. You should really pen down your risks on your risk register and look to the sort of right hand side of your risk register and say, where's my current assurance, either from my internal management team or from my internal auditors or elsewhere regarding this risk, and therefore where are my gaps, where are my priorities, where are the questions that I want answered. So that could lead you to an internal audit plan that's quite wide ranging. Some examples could be IT systems, cybersecurity, network security, wider business continuity or disaster recovery, preparations for coronavirus snow days or national GCSE English or maths days, lessons learnt and resilience testing following our period now, HR, staff recruitment, training, absence management, performance management, teaching and quality of learning and assessment. So from an assurance point of view as a board, how do you know that what you're being told about the standards of teaching across the schools is accurate? Is it right? And importantly, where there's interventions needed or actions, are those actions effective? Have they been taken? What's the result? Student and staff mental health and well-being, safeguarding, health and safety estates, premises, and succession planning are all examples, but certainly not an exhaustive list of areas that you should be considering. So the question for me is a step back one. You need to work with your internal auditors to have a look at your current risk register and risks in general, and then particularly where you are currently assured, and then have a sensible joint conversation about saying these are the areas that it would be of most use for our internal auditors to help us answer. So to answer the point about going beyond the remit of the financial handbook, I think the remit of the handbook is simply saying to you, you need to have a clearer visibility on all of your risks, non-financial as well as financial, than you've possibly had before. But how you go about that is up to you. The scope is really over to you. You decide which risks are important and which risks you need to be assured about. But talk to your internal auditors, because it really should be a joint conversation.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Alistair. So I think, Yvonne, probably the next one's for you, as it's around safeguarding. Are there any particular safeguarding points that the boards should look out for at this time? Yvonne, you need to turn your mic on, please.
Apologies, thanks. Sorry. So in terms of the board, in relation to safeguarding, then as I say, what I would be advising the board to do is to ensure that it has overall oversight of all the safeguarding arrangements in all of the individual schools. Ensuring that all of those annexes or similar have been implemented, that sufficient staff training has taken place, and to ensure that they are able to implement it. But then also looking at those policies and thinking about whether they are now fit for purpose in terms of the reopening, so the next phase. And also thinking about the duty and the statutory keeping children safe in education guidance, that requires at least an annual review. Well, clearly in these circumstances, it's going to require a more frequent review than just the annual review, I would say.
Lovely. Thanks, Yvonne. So the next one I think is probably for Sally. It's all around the role of the audit committee. So the question here is, can the chair of the audit committee work with the chief exec and the CFO on some aspects of current risks, or must it be the full audit committee meeting?
Thanks, Pam. Absolutely. As a critical friend, it's really important for the chair of the trust board, or indeed the audit committee, to be really closely supporting the executive leaders, the CEO. So yeah, absolutely. But what is really important to understand, there is no autonomous decision-making ability, as Chloe said previously. So absolutely to discuss and look and assess and look at ways to mitigate risks, absolutely. But when it comes to decision-making, it needs to go to the audit committee for recommendation at full board level.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Sally. Alistair, this one is no doubt for you, back on internal assurance again. So the question here is, do we still need to submit a formal end of year internal scrutiny report?
So the answer to that question as it stands is yes. In the letter from Eileen Milner, that talked about asking trusts to decide how practical remote internal scrutiny visits would be. There was still confirmation that you needed to submit all of your end of year returns, including the end of year scrutiny report. So the advice from me would be to make sure that you're talking to your internal scrutiny function, your internal auditors now, if you haven't already. Try and decide the practicalities of a remote visit. More can be done remotely than perhaps you think, and actually it would be worth exploring what the art of the possible is there. It would be better to put something in an end of year scrutiny report rather than nothing. But something else that we've been talking to a lot of trusts about is that, how do I take risk management forward? In theory, to start an end of year scrutiny report, you need to be clear what your own risk management processes are, and therefore what the outcomes of those processes have been. So how have you identified and monitored risk during the year? How have you monitored your related assurances? And therefore, as a result, what have you asked your internal scrutiny function to look at? And then what have been the results of those visits? So you need to be able to answer those first couple of paragraphs, talk to your internal auditors about your risk management process, because one of the reviews that we can easily do remotely to help is a review of your risk management process, some suggestions of easy next steps, making it practical for you, which means that you've already got a first step towards that end of year scrutiny report.
Lovely, thanks, Alistair. I think we'll be staying with you for the next one as well. So next question is all about risk registers. How do academies ensure that the maintenance, monitoring and reporting of the risk register is not seen as a purely box ticking exercise? It's all too common to think of it as it's an additional paper burden that needs to be tagged onto the end of a meeting. And actually, for me, that's if you're at that stage, then it's not helping you. It's seen as a burden and it's not a value. So I would pare it back and start again almost by saying, well, actually, why isn't it working for us? I say your internal auditors can do a review with you of your risk management process, but I go back to the basics. As I said, I would keep it simple. I would just ask the questions about what's worrying us, what are we able to do about those things, what are our key priorities and actions. If your risk register is prompting the right challenge and debate, then that's all its purpose is there to do. It's to give you comfort. So if it's not currently doing that, if you're considering it more to be a paper-based box-ticking exercise that you have to complete a form that you see no value flowing out of the end of, I would take a step back and ask, well, why aren't we seeing the value? What do we need to change as a trust to make sure that this is a valuable tool? It's about reviewing actual risk on the ground and actual assurance on the ground. The risk register should just be capturing that. If it isn't, have a chat to your auditors, but also I would recommend doing a session at an audit committee just to ask the question, how can we make this more valuable? That's great, thanks, Alistair. Chloe or Yvonne, I think this is probably one for you, given it, I think it has a bit of a legal angle on it. So there's a good question on here about serious incidents and about what part do trustees have to play in reporting serious incidents to the ESFA?
I'm happy to say that one, Pam. So just take a step back. So Academy trusts are required to comply with the Charity Commission guidance on reporting serious incidents. But obviously the obligation is instead to report to the ESFA. So there is guidance out there on what sort of incidents you'd be required to report. I think probably quite a few trusts that don't know that obligation is out there. The obligation is actually on the trustees, but it's the sort of thing that you would expect to be delegated to somebody, because often you need to do the report quite promptly. Trustees are often quite nervous about reporting serious incidents because they might be dealing with a particular, say it's a safeguarding issue or something, they want to just crack on and deal with this without external scrutiny. But it is really important that they take clear steps to report it, because it's a way in which the trustees demonstrate that they understand their risk management obligations, and it's really demonstrating that they're sort of taking steps to manage those risks and the incident that's arisen. Lovely, thanks Chloe. Question about audit committees. I'm not sure who wants to take this, possibly either Alistair or Sally. So the question is, should the audit committee meetings be deferred in favour of more regular full board meetings during this time? I'll take that.
Actually, I'd recommend the opposite. The audit committee is the forum for the more detailed risk and assurance debates. So these can then be fed to the board, releasing time at board to focus on other things. Although some risks will naturally need to be discussed by the full board. So for me, the key is as much what the procedure and triggers would be to elevate certain risks up to board for full sight and visibility and discussion, and what the audit committee can rightfully concentrate on to as I say, to release that board time. But in particular with the reopening plan and related risk assessments, whilst it is a full board decision, I think there is real merit in getting the audit committee to do a first challenge and review, to look at the viability with the management team, and then make a joint and informed discussion recommendation to the full board regarding the sort of validation of that risk assessment.
Okay, and I think we're probably staying with you for the next question, Alistair. This is a question from Sue, and her question is, given the large range of areas requiring assurance, who is best placed to be engaged to do this? Previously, we hired internal audit as it was financials. Is there someone more suitable now?
Well, your internal auditors are the suitable function. The sort of you need to look at the range of areas that you now need to be assured on, and as I say, that's financial and non-financial. We gave some example areas just now, but it's about approaching someone that can do that for you. And previous arrangements allowed you to have one external trustee or someone external to do effectively a responsible officer financial controls check. It is likely that the wider ranging audit needs that you now have, looking across those non-financial areas, may need someone more experienced. So you may need to turn to a firm if you haven't already done that. I'm not saying there's a one size fits all though, because if you're a small single trust, it may be completely appropriate just to maintain your existing arrangements. But your internal auditors should be the one to cover your financial and non-financial risk area. So a specialist internal audit team and internal audit firm will be able to offer you assurances on most, if not all, of your risks. So have a chat to your internal audit team, first of all, and then really, though, it's about answering the what do we need question. So it's having that risk assurance debate at an audit committee first, and then you'll better identify your internal assurance needs.
Lovely, thanks, Alistair. I think this is a follow-up question for you, Chloe, if I may. So, and I'm not quite sure what else you can add, but it is obviously an area of concern. So there's a question on here that says, our board is very apprehensive about the possible repercussions of reopening. Can we leave the decision to our CEO? So do you have any words of wisdom that you can maybe share with boards of trustees who are currently wrestling with this? And I'd be very interested from my own personal position as well to hear what you've got to say.
Firstly, I completely understand why anybody would be apprehensive about this situation. It's a very difficult one, first and foremost. The answer is no. It's not something that can simply be left to the CEO. I mean, I explained earlier, it is an operational decision, but the duties, the trustees still have responsibilities. They still have duties to oversee that, and you know, we've heard all about the risk management duties that trustees have. In terms of any exposure that they might have to personal liabilities, they actually put themselves in a much better position if they engage fully with the process. If they are acting reasonably, if they've put in place, if they've overseen a risk assessment which has been challenged for its robustness, that will put them in a much stronger position. I mean, ultimately, a trustee who's acted honestly and reasonably is likely to be protected by insurance and wouldn't have anything to worry about. Sally, do you have anything you wanted to add on that one?
No, I think you're absolutely right, Chloe. It's a really difficult one. You have the balance between support and challenge. Obviously, the support has to be there, but for protection and their own moral understanding that we're doing the right thing, and that has to be behind the driver of all of this. You know, are we doing the right thing for all the pupils within our organisation? Are they going to be safe or as safe within the guidelines as they can be? have we covered all the risks, and have we collectively made that decision together so that we are looking from lots of different angles, lots of different perspectives, and really owning that joint decision to reopen at whatever point that happens to be. So no, I think that would be my only sort of coverall add-on at the end there.
Okay, and I think just to add to the comments that Chloe and Sally have made, the conversations I've been having with trustees of clients is that their biggest concern is that they are not the experts and they're trying to make decisions based on information that the senior leadership team are giving them, but the trustees themselves are nervous because they're not the experts. So I can fully sympathise with anybody who's a trustee of an academy at the moment who's trying to make that decision. I'm just looking to see whether we've got any other questions that we need that have come in. I think we've probably answered most of them. There are some that we haven't answered directly, but I think have been answered perhaps indirectly through some of our answers to other questions. So I'm just having a look down here. Right, well, I can't see any more. So I think probably what that leaves me just to say is thank you to everybody who's attended. Thank you for the speakers for taking part, and just as a reminder, don't forget to look at both websites for Bishop Fleming and VWV. There's an awful lot of information there. We will be sending out the questions and answers to all the attendees. The webinar has been recorded, so we'll be sending that out as well. And don't forget, we have if you haven't already seen it, we've got another webinar running tomorrow morning, which is about a much more wider COVID-19, about how commercial businesses can get up and running again. So if that's of interest to you, please do look out for that. You can find that on Eventbrite, or you can message any of us and we will send you the link through to that. So again, just leaves me to say thank you to everybody, and hopefully we will get to speak to you all soon. Thank you very much. Bye.